29th of June 1958, Solna, Sweden. 50,000 people cram into the Rosunda Stadium to witness a game where the reward would enter a nation into footballing immortality. Of course, only one side could win. But prior to the competition starting, not many would predict that a 17-year-old boy who only a couple of years prior was shining shoes despite not even owning a pair of his own would be the defining factor. But how did we get here? Well, where better to start than Rio de Janeiro in 1950. On the 23rd of June, just one day before the 1950 World Cup kicked off, unopposed, the Nordic nation of Sweden, with their impressive stadium infrastructure, were awarded the hosting rights for the 1958 World Cup. FIFA once again broke the hosting rotation between Europe and South America, and with just 7.5 million inhabitants, it was questioned whether or not Sweden would be able to host such a tournament, especially one with the increasing popularity of the World Cup. Perhaps to combat this, unlike Uruguay in 1930, when just one city hosted, Sweden did the exact opposite, having 12 different towns and cities in the south of the country entertain at least one of the 32 guaranteed games. In World Cups gone by, it was quite common for teams to qualify without even kicking a ball, which is why you saw some unlikely nations participate. But by 1958, FIFA, in their infinite wisdom, put a stop to such shenanigans. If you wanted to qualify for the World Cup, you had to play at least 2 qualifying games. To be fair, the 1958 World Cup qualifiers were the least chaotic so far, but it wasn't without its controversy. Although this had pretty much always been the case anyway, qualifying was now officially split into separate confederations, and the British Home Championship would no longer be used as a qualifying group. Alongside host Sweden and current champions West Germany, 14 more nations qualified. In Europe, 9 spots were guaranteed, with East Germany, Iceland and the Soviet Union taking part for the first time. Each group had 3 teams, who played each other twice, with top spots qualifying. In Group 1, England needed a last-minute equaliser from Bristol City legend John Atyeo against the Republic of Ireland to secure qualification. Many journalists lambasted England's performance, and that goal from Atyeo, which was almost certainly his last touch of the game, ended up being his final touch for England, as he never played for the Three Lions again. In Group 2, France were once again remarkably free-scoring, qualifying ahead of Belgium and Iceland. In their 6-3 triumph over Belgium, Tadej Sisovski became the last man to score 5 in one game for Le Bleu. Post-revolution Hungary made their way past Bulgaria and Norway in Group 3. East Germany and Wales succumbed to Czechoslovakia and wouldn't qualify for their maiden World Cup. Yet, bronze medalists from 1954, Austria, qualified ahead of the Netherlands in what was essentially an everybody-eats session against Luxembourg. In Group 6, Olympic champions the USSR and Poland finished level on points, meaning they had to take part in a playoff, which the USSR won 2-0 in front of 100,000 people in Leipzig. Yugoslavia then qualified ahead of Romania and Greece in Group 7. Heading over to Group 9, Scotland surprisingly finished ahead of Switzerland and a Spain side that included the likes of Laszlo Kubala, Paco Gento, Luis Suarez and Alfredo Di Stefano. Although the game which secured qualification, a 3-2 victory over Switzerland, was marred in controversy, as Scotland's third goal by Alex Scott was clearly offside according to everyone besides the linesman. Even Scotland's captain Tommy Docherty believed it to be off. However, this wasn't the most controversial and chaotic game in qualifying. You see, Northern Ireland were meant to play their final game against Italy on the 4th of December. However, due to heavy fog in London the day before, referee Istvan Zsolt, who was staying in England's capital, was struggling to make it to the game. Irish FA General Secretary Billy Drennan arranged for legendary referee Arthur Ellis to travel by ship as a standby if Zsolt couldn't make it. But Italian President Ottorino Barassi refused that idea and preferred to wait for the fog to lift in the morning, which it didn't. Barassi, by the way, was the legendary figure who, during World War II, kept the World Cup trophy underneath his bed in a shoebox in an attempt to stop Nazi troops in Italy from finding it. With local referee Tommy Mitchell taking charge, a friendly was played between the two sides instead, and it was a game so brutal, it was known as the Battle of Belfast. The World Cup qualifier between the two sides took place over a month later, and with them needing a win, Northern Ireland stepped up to the task and beat the two-time world champions 2-1, qualifying for their first World Cup. However, before the draw was even made, Northern Ireland almost withdrew as Northern Irish sides didn't play on Sunday, with it being considered a day of rest. One person writing to the Belfast newsletter wrote, "I hope the IFA will stand firm and not play on Sunday. Let no desire for gain, glory or filthy lucre tempt us to break God's command." And trust me, she was not the only person with this opinion. Nevertheless, on the 28th of January 1958, Northern Ireland confirmed that they would be playing in the 1958 World Cup. Making our way over to North and Central America, the qualifiers were fairly controversial free, as Mexico once again qualified, hoping that they could pick up their first World Cup win in their 4th attempt. Moving down south to the South American qualifiers, again they were just surprisingly normal. Venezuela were the only side to withdraw, and Brazil topped the group that they were supposed to be in. Copa America winners Argentina, who hadn't even attempted to take part in a World Cup since 1934, topped their group thanks to a final game thrashing of Bolivia. In the third and final South American group, possibly the biggest shock in qualifying, as two-time World Cup champions and semi-finalists from 1954 Uruguay failed to qualify, with Paraguay finishing ahead of them. Last but most certainly not least, the daftest section of qualifying between Asia and Africa, who were fighting for a ridiculous one spot. There were 4 groups of 2, with the group winners facing off in one group of 4, and then the top 2 of that group would face each other to decide who'd qualify. Egypt, Indonesia and Sudan all qualified, as did Israel, as their opponents Turkey dropped out due to them wanting to play in the European qualifiers instead. Egypt and Sudan then withdrew due to the Arab League boycott of Israel, as did Indonesia, who still wanted to play Israel but in a neutral venue instead, which FIFA rejected. This meant Israel had qualified for the World Cup. If we were talking about a previous edition, FIFA couldn't allow Israel to turn up in Sweden without playing a single qualifier, so what to do? Well, they drew lots, meaning one of the group runners-up from Europe, South America or CONCACAF would have a second chance of qualifying. Belgium were the first team drawn out, but they refused to play. Therefore, the draw was made again, and the lucky team to have a second chance of qualification were Wales. Wales won both games 2-0 home and away, and became the final side to qualify for the 1958 World Cup. But before we get into any games, let's talk about the competition's format. There were 4 groups of 4 teams, with first and second place advancing to the knockout stages. If you were on the same points total, your goal average determined your position, unless it was between second and third place. In the event of second and third ending on the same points, a playoff would be played. Incredibly though, that final rule looked like it might have changed during the tournament. Some teams complained that another game in such a small amount of time was too much, and FIFA did back that idea, even telling them after the first round of fixtures that goal average would be used to determine positions before resorting to a playoff. However, the Swedish FA soon put the kibosh on those plans, claiming that changing the rules during the tournament was wrong, and they were probably also quite keen on the extra revenue these playoff games provided. The group stages were drawn on the 8th of February 1958, and it was decided beforehand that nations from the same geographical region would be put into the same pot to stop them from playing each other. Pot 1 featured the nations from Central and Western Europe, Pot 2 the sides from the Americas, Pot 3 Eastern European nations, and Pot 4 the 4 British nations. Group 1 comprised of Argentina, Czechoslovakia, Northern Ireland, and the world champions, West Germany. For new boys Northern Ireland, this looked quite difficult. On the group, manager Peter Doherty said, "We are afraid of nothing. The Irish have a great fighting spirit, and I have every confidence in the ability of our team to win through to the next stage. We do not mind taking on Germany, the holders, or the Argentine. Better to meet them early on than later." Doherty had good reason to back his side. The smallest nation in the competition, knocking out Italy in qualifying, sent shockwaves across the footballing world. Also, they had some incredibly strong players, including Britain's Footballer of the Year, Tottenham's Danny Blanchflower, and in goal, Harry Gregg, the hero of Munich, a nickname given to Gregg not because of heroics on the pitch, but his heroics off it. After the Munich air disaster, Gregg pulled Matt Busby, teammates Bobby Charlton, Dennis Violet, and Danny Blanchflower's brother Jackie from the wreck. In addition to his teammates, Greg helped save Vera Lukic, the wife of a Yugoslav diplomat, and her daughter Vesna. World champions West Germany came into the World Cup with a vastly different squad than the one that won in 1954, only retaining 7 players, including the hero of the final Helmut Rahn and the icon Fritz Walter, now 37 years of age. Sepp Herberger was in charge of his nation for a third World Cup, and although Bernhard Klotz's goals were massive in Schalke winning the league in 1958, West Germany had a different goal-scoring sensation within their ranks. His name was Uwe Seeler. Seeler was a freak goalscorer for HSV, and at just 21 years of age, he had just finished his 4th season in professional football with a record of 26 goals in 28 games. Statistically, that was his worst season so far, and his worst until 1965 when he tore his ACL. The South American champions Argentina arrived in Sweden with an enormous amount of expectation. Managed by the World Cup's first top scorer Guillermo Stabile, the expectation was understandable. You see, they didn't just win the Copa America, they absolutely demolished it, only losing their last game against Peru, which was a dead rubber. Nevertheless, Argentina had 2 problems. Argentina had hardly played a European side for the 3 previous years, therefore they'd been in their own South American bubble and hadn't adapted to the game across the rest of the world. Their second problem was a problem that they'd encountered in 1934. All of their best players get buggering off to Italy. Argentina had an elite front 5 during the Copa America, nicknamed Carasucias, but 3 of their front 5, Umberto Macho, Antonio Angelillo and Omar Siveri, also known as the Trio of Death, all left for Italy swiftly after and weren't in consideration for the national side anymore. Outside of the wingers Osvaldo Cruz and the troubled yet brilliant Omar Kobata, alongside 39-year-old Angel Lebruna, the selfless striker for River Plate's own famous 5 known as La Maquina, the other attackers selected were incredibly inexperienced at international level. But just because they were inexperienced didn't mean they weren't good. So could they bring the 1930 finalists their first ever world title? Well, it certainly didn't start well, as for their first game against champions West Germany in Malmo, they forgot their kit and had to borrow Malmo's yellow strip. However, La Albiceleste took the lead through Kobata's ferocious near-post shot. Argentina continued to play very well, but West Germany's quality eventually shone through, as goals from Seeler and a brace from the hero of 1954 Helmut Rahn set West Germany off to a flying start. Moving north to Halmstad, the debuting Northern Ireland faced Czechoslovakia without Billy Simpson of Rangers, who failed a late fitness test. Taking his place was Portsmouth's Derek Dougan, who had just come off the back of a decent first season in English football. Although Dougan didn't play a great game, Northern Ireland certainly did, and after studying how the Danubian Czechoslovaks struggled with the long ball, they took advantage. With tactics straight out of the Tony Pulis handbook, Northern Ireland won their first World Cup game 1-0 thanks to Leeds United's Wilbur Cush. Their next game was against an Argentina side desperate for a win, and without 3 of their front 5. 39-year-old Angel Lebruna led the attack, and it seemingly did the trick, as they reversed their defeat to West Germany 3-1, handing Northern Ireland not only their first World Cup loss, but their first loss of the entire year. But anyone who watched that game knew Northern Ireland were unlucky to come out with a defeat. In the group's other fixture, Czechoslovakia and West Germany drew 2-2, meaning it was all to play for in the final set of fixtures. West Germany only needed a draw to guarantee qualification, which is exactly what they got, thanks in part to the inspired performance from Harry Gregg in goal and Peter McParland, who scored twice for the Northern Irish. But what that also meant was that if Argentina couldn't beat Czechoslovakia, Northern Ireland were guaranteed a playoff spot. Argentina, who hadn't been playing well against the European sides, got hit with a nasty reality check, and their World Cup campaign came to a disastrous end as they got beaten to a pulp 6-1, and they were not given a warm reception back on arrival. To the surprise of many, that result guaranteed a playoff spot for Northern Ireland, and their opponents were Czechoslovakia. Northern Ireland were without Harry Gregg in goal and Tommy Casey at outside left, and were replaced by Norman Upritchard and Jackie Scott. This time, however, unlike their previous encounter, Czechoslovakia found a goal, but once again, as did McParland. The game finished 1-1 after 90 minutes, and with extra time minutes away, Billy Bingham ordered his teammates perform an exercise of calisthenics. The physically drained Czechoslovaks couldn't believe their eyes, and the show of energy in an attempt to intimidate seemingly did the trick, as McParland struck home the winning goal. Having entered an incredibly strong group, Northern Ireland, who could only afford to take 17 players to Sweden, had miraculously qualified for the knockout stages. Group 2 saw France, Scotland, Paraguay and Yugoslavia battle it out for the top 2 spots. The French side was incredibly strong, and the usual starting 11 was dominated by players from Reims, including Robert Jonquet, Roger Mars, Jean Vincent, and a 24-year-old striker taking the French league by storm, Just Fontaine. However, the star of this team was no longer playing his football in France for Reims, but in Spain for Real Madrid. With Spain missing out on qualification, Raymond Kopa was the only player at this World Cup to have won the European Cup, winning it in 1957 and 1958. But who was Raymond Kopa, and why was he the star of this star-studded French side? Kopa was born in the north of France to Polish parents who moved there during the First World War. The town was called Noulamine, a small mining town southwest of Lille, and aged 14 in 1945, Kopa followed his father and grandfather down the mines in order to make ends meet, and a couple of years later, he lost half of his index finger on his left hand. Because of his footballing talents, Kopa was able to leave the mining business behind at a young age. Not only was he playing for his town's main football team, but after finishing second in France's young football player trial, Second Division Angers decided to offer him a contract after sides such as Reims and Lille deemed him to be too fragile. I thought I would get a contract from one of the big northern clubs, Lille, Lens, Valenciennes or Roubaix. So I was really disappointed when a second division side from Western France, Angers, made me the only offer, Kopa recalled. Kopa only spent a couple of years in the west of France, plying his trade in the second division, but his talents were becoming more apparent, and the largest sides in the country were after him. Eventually, the side that secured his signature were Coupe de France winners Reims. Under Albert Bateau, Reims played what could only be described as champagne football. With Bateau's side taking the nation by storm, in the next 5 years, Kopa would go on to be a regular for the national side, win 2 league titles, a Latin Cup, and reach the first ever European Cup final, losing to Real Madrid. After this game, Kopa joined Los Blancos and their star-studded side, where in a side that could not stop winning trophies, he became a huge fan favourite with his dazzling dribbling wowing the crowds inside the Santiago Bernabeu. Nicknamed Copita, in his first 2 years leading to the 1958 World Cup, Kopa won 2 league titles, a Latin Cup, and 2 European Cups, becoming the first French player to achieve the latter. Remarkably though, even with that CV, his selection in the French side was hotly contested, as he hadn't played for the national side in almost 2 years, due to him playing his football outside of France. Fortunately for him, former international striker and director of the French national side Paul Nicolas was adamant Kopa be selected, which he was. Over to Great Britain now, and after the debacle that was the 1954 World Cup, the Scots were more prepared this time, and they were also quite optimistic after the draw. But some of that optimism would be lost after the 1958 Munich air disaster, as Sir Matt Busby, Manchester United's manager, was meant to take charge of Scotland for this World Cup. Of course, the legendary manager was unable to take charge, so physio Dawson Walker took over, much like he did in 1954 after Andy Beattie left. And much like 1954, he really didn't know what he was doing. Because of this, training was either non-existent or designed by the players themselves, which always goes well. But with Scotland actually taking a full-strength squad this time, they still had a chance to make an impact. The first set of fixtures pitted France against Paraguay and Yugoslavia versus Scotland. Archie Robertson and Tommy Docherty of Scotland, the latter of which Walker saw as a troublemaker, was sent on a scouting mission to watch France and Paraguay instead of taking part in their game against the Yugoslavs, who had ended their World Cup preparations with a 5-0 win over England. The pair missed out on Scotland producing a more than honourable 1-1 draw against the Yugoslavs. What they instead saw was an attacking masterclass reminiscent of the World Cup 4 years prior. The top scorers in South American qualifying, Paraguay, put 3 past the French side, who put down a performance that would set the tone for the remainder of their tournament, as a hat-trick from the rapid Just Fontaine and an incredible finish off the knee from Kopa handed France a 7-3 victory. The troublemaker in Docherty compiled an impressive report regarding what he saw in the game, highlighting Paraguay's poor defence, especially at fullback, alongside the frightening abilities of Fontaine and Kopa. Yet, in an incredibly dense move, none of the Scottish coaching party even bothered looking at the report. It was a decision that may have had tournament-defining consequences, because although Paraguayan manager Aurelio Gonzalez promised to tighten up the defence against Scotland, they weren't going to abandon the way they played entirely, and the result of that was a 3-2 Paraguay win. Meanwhile, in Västerås, a late Todor Veselinovic goal handed Yugoslavia a 3-2 victory over France, setting the final group game up very nicely. In the end, France and Scotland provided a really entertaining game of football, and although France won 2-1, they were quite fortunate to come out alive, as Scotland paid for missing big chances, including a penalty miss from John Huey. Once again, Kopa and Fontaine made the difference, scoring both of France's goals. Finally in the group, Paraguay drew 3-3 with Yugoslavia, meaning the South Americans finished third in the group, missing out on qualification for the quarters. However, this World Cup saw some Paraguayans really stand out, and most of them got big moves to Spain. Jose Aguero even won the European Cup in 1966 with Real Madrid. Group 3 saw host Sweden handed what many saw as quite a comfortable group, alongside Wales, Hungary and Mexico. Now, any group in the 50s involving Hungary should have been seen as quite a daunting task. After all, these were the 1952 Olympic champions, the 1954 World Cup finalists, and a side who played revolutionary football under Gustav Sebes. Except, this was not that team anymore. In 1956 came the Hungarian Revolution, when, led by Imre Nagy, thousands of Hungarians rose against the Soviet-backed communist regime in Hungary. The reasons for this range from years of Soviet oppression, economic hardship, and the right to leave the Warsaw Pact. The revolution was ultimately crushed by the Soviets, who re-established their communist control in the country, and large waves of Hungarian citizens left the country, including a lot of their players. Budapest Honvéd, the country's best team, used their European Cup tie against Athletic Bilbao as an excuse to leave the country, based themselves in Brussels, and eventually went on a tour of Brazil and Venezuela once they were knocked out by Bilbao. MTK, who weren't in any European competition at all, were also very fortunate to leave the country. On the 1st of November, the MTK players were gathered together and were taken to Vienna in massive Chevrolet cars, said former player Laszlo Bodor. In the end, players such as Gyula Grosic, Nandor Hidegkuti and Josip Bosic returned, and even played for Hungary in the 1958 World Cup. However, key players such as Zoltán Csibor, Sandor Kocsis and the great Ferenc Puskás all left. Add this to the fact that their under-21 side, who were based in Switzerland during the revolution, just never returned. Alongside one of the great coaches in Bela Gutmann, there was no new generation, and 40 years of golden Hungarian football had practically come to an end. Now, whilst Hungary were busy losing their best players, the exact opposite could be said for host Sweden and their Yorkshire-born manager George Rayner. Despite a local ban on foreign-based players, preventing 3 of the best players on the planet representing them, Sweden finished third at the 1950 World Cup. The suspension, however, was lifted before the 1958 finals, allowing Serie A's own quintet of Bent Gustafsson, Kurt Hamrin, Nils Lidholm, Arne Salmason and Lennart Skorlund to make Rayner's squad. Bringing these players in was a huge boost for Sweden, and they were also given another boost when their Helsingborg goalkeeper Kalle Svensson was given time off from being a firefighter to play in this World Cup. But although Sweden had a large section of their squad playing in Italy, the best player playing his football in Italy at the time was Welsh. Nicknamed the Gentle Giant, 6'2" John Charles had been a second division footballer for almost the entirety of his 11-year career. In 1956, that finally changed when he and Leeds United were finally promoted to the First Division, and his first season in the top flight was insane, scoring 38 goals in 40 games. That truly outstanding season got Charles a huge move to Juventus for a then British record £65,000, and he'd enjoy what was an immaculate first campaign. The old lady had endured a handful of poor seasons leading to the arrival of Charles, but once he and Omar Sivori joined, their trident with club captain Giampiero Boniperti instantly made Juventus champions for a 10th time. Charles won the Capocannoniere in his first season, scoring 28 of what would be 105 Bianconeri goals. The most effective player I ever saw, the one that made the most difference to the performance of the whole team was without question John Charles, said his former Leeds United teammate Jack Charlton. It's a statement that's hard to argue with. Charles ended his career with 385 goals in 753 games. But something I haven't mentioned, he wasn't just a striker. Charles also regularly played as a centre-back. His form going into this World Cup was otherworldly, and alongside Cliff Jones, Ivor Allchurch and his own brother Mal Charles, there was every chance Wales could go far. The first game of this group was in fact the first game of this entire World Cup, as Sweden faced Mexico in Solna at 2 PM local time. With the opening ceremony over with and the World Cup opened by FIFA President Arthur Drury and Sweden's King Gustav VI, Mexico kicked off the 1958 World Cup looking to not lose an opening game for the 4th time in a row. And to be fair to them, they started off this game incredibly well, forcing goalkeeper Kalle Svensson into 2 wonderful saves. Yet, despite the pressure they put on, Sweden's quality shone as their foreign-based stars put on an absolute clinic. Lidholm ran the game, Hamrin was a nuisance, and Skoglund sent the Mexican fullback dizzy, creating 2 goals for the future Real Madrid striker Agne Simonsen, sending the home crowd away happy with a 3-0 victory. A few hours later, Wales took part in their inaugural World Cup game against the current runners-up Hungary, who, as we know, were a little bit weaker, but they were still favourites and they still had some very good players, including striker Lajos Tichy, who, according to RSSF, is the most prolific goalscorer in history with 1,917 goals. The day before this game, Wales won 19-0 in a friendly against the local amateur side, a result which Leos Barotti, the Hungary coach, travelled 140 miles to witness. Anyway, the game between Wales and Hungary may not have produced 19 goals, but according to sources, it was a very fun and tough tackling game. The match ended 1-1 after goals from Member of Parliament Boschik and a header from John Charles. Goalkeepers Grostic and Kelsey had wonderful games, but that didn't stop the fans from booing the Hungarians as John Charles was booted into the air savagely at every given opportunity. The draw was a brilliant result for Wales. It was their first point on the board, and even better, their next opponents were the World Cup's historical whipping boys in Mexico. The game inside the Rosunda Stadium was history-making, but not for Wales. In the 89th minute, Jaime Belmonte scored an equalising goal for Mexico, meaning for the first time in their World Cup history, after losing 9 games on the spin, Mexico finally had a World Cup point to their name. The next day inside the same stadium was this group's clash of the titans, Sweden versus Hungary. With Nandor Hidegkuti hurt, he was taken out of the starting 11, but was replaced by, of all people, right-half Boschik, pushing Tichy into the inside right position, proving that Mikel Arteta's influence on the game is truly insane. The change in personnel clearly didn't work. Outside of a few scares and a screamer from Tichy, Sweden were dominant throughout the game, as a Kurt Hamrin brace confirmed the Swedes as officially the first team to qualify into the knockout stages. Because of this, Sweden put out a weaker side for their final game against Wales in a game that ended 0-0. With that result, it meant that Hungary had to get a win against Mexico in order to force a playoff against Wales, which they did quite comfortably, winning 4-0. For the playoff, Wales's Cliff Jones and Terry Medwin passed late fitness test, yet for Hungary, Hidegkuti had picked up yet another injury and missed out on the game. However, the minds of many Hungarians, including the players, were probably elsewhere, as the day before the leader of the revolution in 1956, Imre Nagy, was executed. A decision that angered a lot of people. Many fans boycotted the game and protest even began inside of the stadium, leading to the lowest attended game of this World Cup. Wales won the game 2-1, but it came at a huge cost, as John Charles, who once again was practically kicked out of the game, was going to be unavailable for their quarter-final tie. Finally, over to Group 4, a group which many people saw as the group of death. For England, only Tom Finney and Billy Wright survived from the 1954 World Cup squad. Manager Walter Winterbottom commented on the draw saying, "It is a tough draw for us. I'm confident we can reach the next stage, and it may be as well to come up against the hardest opposition at the start." But of course, it's almost impossible to mention England in the 1958 World Cup without talking about the Munich air disaster. Guarantees for this squad, Roger Byrne, Tommy Taylor, and most famously Duncan Edwards, all had their lives tragically cut short on that day, and it had a huge impact on the squad. Byrne, a fullback who at 28 was in the prime of his career, captained Manchester United for multiple seasons, and was a hot candidate to eventually replace Billy Wright in wearing the armband for the Three Lions. At 26 years of age, Tommy Taylor, meanwhile, was one of the most consistent scorers in England's top flight, and for the national team, he was firing on all cylinders. He was the heir to Nat Lofthouse's throne, and so good was Taylor that the great Alfredo Di Stefano dubbed him Magnifico. Duncan Edwards, on the other hand, was seen to be on a different level to everyone else. Only 21 years of age when he died, many considered the left half to be the best player that they had ever played with. The most complete footballer I've ever seen. In Duncan Edwards, I believe I have the greatest footballer in the world, said his manager Sir Matt Busby. His doggedness, skill and power in England's midfield would be duly missed, for England had arguably lost their finest player of the time. Bobby Robson, Derek Cavan and Johnny Haynes were at the peak of their powers for their respective clubs, and they had with Tom Finney and captain Billy Wright a couple of the most experienced players in international football. In 1956, the USSR rose to heights they had yet to achieve in the international game, when in front of 86,000 people, they beat a near-full Yugoslavia side 1-0 in the gold medal match at the Melbourne Olympics. Officially an amateur side winning an amateur tournament, the Soviets looked at succeeding against the professionals west of the Iron Curtain in what was their first World Cup. Their squad featured icons of the Soviet game, including Igor Neto, Anatoly Ilyin, Nikita Simonyan, and with his famous cap, one of the greatest goalkeepers of all time, Lev Yashin. Yashin not only stood out as a goalkeeper because of his iconic look, which gave him the nickname of the Black Spider, but he was truly a one-of-a-kind goalkeeper. As a teenager, Yashin started to help out with the Soviet Union's war effort, working in a factory and training to become an electrical mechanic, and it's during this time he started to excel at different sports, most notably ice hockey and football. In 1949, at 19 years of age, Yashin was spotted by Dynamo Moscow youth coach Arkady Chernyshov, and he joined the side, playing second fiddle to their great goalkeeper, Alexei Tiger Komich, an incredibly brave and agile goalkeeper. Komich mentored Yashin, and by 1953, when the Tiger picked up an injury, the Black Spider pounced, and he never looked back. Not only would his style of play not look overly out of place in the modern game with his cat-like reflexes and famously aggressive nature, whether it be meeting on-rushing attackers or coming out to punch away crosses, Yashin also saved a ridiculous 151 penalties in his career. Yashin revolutionised the role of the goalkeeper like no other before him by always being ready to act as an extra defender, wrote France Football. By the start of the 1958 World Cup, Yashin had already won 3 Soviet League titles and was an Olympic gold medalist. However, his most notable accolade came after this World Cup, when in 1963 he won the Ballon d'Or, then known as the European Footballer of the Year award, being the only goalkeeper to do so. So I've talked about a very important player that was there for the USSR, but what about a very important player that wasn't there? 18-year-old Eduard Streltsov had been one of the best players in the Olympics. However, he would not play in the gold medal match as their coach, Gavril Kachalin, wanted a front pair who played together at club level. Originally, he had this in Torpedo Moscow duo, Valentin Ivanov and Streltsov. But in the semi-final, Ivanov picked up an injury, meaning he'd missed the final. And of course, because of Kachalin's desire to have a strike partnership of players from the same club, Streltsov, who had carried the Soviets over the line in the semi-final, was dropped. The USSR won the game 1-0, but because Streltsov didn't play in the final, he wasn't handed a gold medal. Not to worry though, he thought. Nikita, I will win many other trophies, he told Simonyan, his replacement. To be fair, he was right to be confident. Even at 18, Streltsov was probably the best outfield player the Soviet Union had. He had scored 2 hat-tricks in his first 2 games for the national team, had already become the youngest top scorer in Soviet top-flight history in 1955, and he was the nation's great hope. So where was he? Well, it all came crashing down for him just a month before the World Cup kicked off, when he and international teammates Mikhail Ogonkov and Boris Tatushin were invited to a party by Soviet military officer Eduard Karakanov. Ever the party animal, Streltsov and his teammates decided to go, despite having to be back at the Dinamo Stadium later that day. At the party was a 20-year-old woman by the name of Marina Lebedeva, and by the next morning, all 3 players were arrested and charged with raping her. Allegedly, Streltsov admitted to the charge, but only because he was told that by admitting to the charge, he'd be able to play in the World Cup. Ogonkov and Tatushin were both handed 3-year bans from football, whereas Streltsov was given a 12-year sentence to the Gulag. The legitimacy of this accusation has always been questioned, but with Soviet football reaching a golden era, and with it being such a huge help in their propaganda push, why would the higher-ups want to take their best and most popular player out of the side? The accepted story for this was that he just got on the wrong side of someone important. Yekaterina Furtseva became an influential figure in Soviet politics under Nikita Khrushchev, and it was with Furtseva's daughter that Streltsov had an alleged relationship with. During a party to celebrate the side winning gold at the Olympics, Furtseva suggested that Streltsov and her daughter would marry, which the almost certainly drunk Streltsov responded by saying either, "I would never marry that monkey," or "I would rather be hanged than marry such a girl." Add this to the fact Streltsov was already secretly marrying someone else, Furtseva was incredibly humiliated, and with her links to the Kremlin, likely had Streltsov punished in incredibly harsh circumstances. The story surrounding what happened to Streltsov was not known around the world, so when he wasn't in the squad, it came as a huge surprise to everyone. Before the games even kicked off, English journalist Jack Part went to the Soviet Union training camp in Sweden, and one of the questions he asked was, where was Streltsov and why was he dropped? One official completely ignored him, another claimed it was best for teamwork and spirit, and the third responded with, he drinks too much, but it was a difficult decision to take because he is greatly admired as a player by Khrushchev. Streltsov did return to play for club and country in 1965, but it meant the Soviet Union were without their star talent, which could not be said for Brazil. The Seleção's history in the World Cup had been nothing short of crazy. The footballing mad nation had endured 2 battles and a national catastrophe compared to Hiroshima, according to playwright Nelson Rodriguez, but they had yet to win the competition. One of the reasons behind this consistent failure was a lack of tactical identity. In 1938, they played a WM more akin to Vittorio Pozzo's WW, with Martin Silveira as the aggressive metodo, something brought to the Brazilian game by Hungarian Dori Kirchner. However, this was seen as too defensively weak, often leaving the 2 fullbacks for dead, and it lacked the chance of fluidity higher up. In 1950, Flavio Costa, who did not like Kirchner, brought in the diagonal, forcing the middle of the WM into a parallelogram, retaining 3 defenders and forwards. However, quite early into the tournament, Costa found it too open when he came up against Karl Rappan's Switzerland, who played an early form of Catenaccio. Rappan's side were able to soak up a lot of pressure and then hit on a counter. Brazil quickly moved back to the WM, something Zizinho blamed for their shortcomings in this World Cup, as a lot of the players didn't really know how to play it. They were then knocked out of the 1954 World Cup by playing a standard WM, but by 1958 they had finally found a formation that allowed attacking prowess, flexibility and defensive stability. Under Vicente Fiola, who the Brazilian Federation saw as a safe option, lined Brazil up in a 4-2-4. However, in practice, this was rarely ever the shape. In possession, it was a 3-3-4, as right-sided centre-half and captain Hilderaldo Bellini pushed into the midfield, alongside the technically elegant Didi and the side's solid defensive midfielder Zito. The gaps out wide also allowed their fullbacks to push forward. Yet, out of possession, it was a 4-3-3, with Brazil's outside left Mario Zagallo dropping into the midfield, providing balance as their right winger was certainly not tactically disciplined, but technically on another planet. And that player was none other than Garrincha. Finally, Brazil had to connect the midfield to attack, and they did that by dropping one of their strikers deeper into the Ponta de Lança role, originally used by players such as Matheus Sindelar and Ferenc Puskas. For Brazil's first 2 games, that role was handed to Jose Altafini, nicknamed Mazzola due to his physical resemblance to former Torino star Valentino Mazzola. Although he did quite a good job there, Altafini did not last long in that position, as a certain 17-year-old was returning from injury, ready to take the world by storm. Brazil believed that they had finally cracked their formation issue, but such was their desperation to win the World Cup, they went the extra mile. With heavy funding, Brazil were more prepared for this World Cup than any team had ever been before. Officials scouted 25 different locations in Sweden for a training camp, and once they found the right base in Hindås, west of Gothenburg, they asked the staff of the hotel that they were staying in to replace the female staff with men to avoid any potential distractions. The backroom staff included a dentist, a doctor, a masseur, a psychologist, a trainer, and a spy to collect information on the opposition. The doctor prescribed the team with medication for intestinal parasites, the dentist extracted over 300 teeth, and the psychologist suggested Garrincha not play in high-pressure games. The USSR's first ever World Cup game, which was against England, was nothing short of brutal. 33 fouls conceded by the Soviets in the first half alone, killing any chance of this game being one for the football purists. After being 2-0 down, England fought back to gain a 2-2 draw, although the penalty they won to equalise was controversial. Kachelin said that the incident happened 2 metres outside of the penalty area. The referee gave several wrong decisions, and this was one of them. The Russian team was superior. England forward Tom Finney recalled taking the penalty against the great Yashin. I decided to use my weaker foot because I knew that he'd have seen me strike a few penalties with my left. When I turned around to begin my run-up, some of my teammates had their backs turned. They couldn't bear to watch. You can imagine how I felt, but I scored. I had outfoxed the great Yashin. However, Finney picked up an injury in this game, meaning that his goal against Yashin was his final World Cup touch ever. In Brazil versus Austria, it was all about Mazzola, scoring twice and even assisting left-back Nilton Santos, who found himself at striker, firing Brazil to a 3-0 victory. It was a commanding start by the South Americans, but their momentum would quickly be stifled by England and their imperious goalkeeper Colin McDonald a few days later, when both sides produced the World Cup's first ever 0-0 draw. The Soviet Union then beat Austria 2-0, meaning for the final group fixtures, England had to better any Soviet Union results in order to force a playoff. With an unchanged side against Austria, England produced a frustrating 2-2 draw. Austria, for their part, scored 2 brilliant goals, but England left the game with a bitter taste in their mouths, as Bobby Robson's late winner was controversially disallowed for handball. If England had any chance of qualifying, they needed a favour from Brazil. And fortunately for them, a teenager unknown to the rest of the world was about to help them and change the football world forever. Born in Tres Corações in 1940, Pele grew up in Bauru, poverty-stricken. As a child, he grew up idolising his father, Dondinho, who himself was a capable footballer. In 1944, the family got what seemed like a big break when Lusitana gave Dondinho an invitation to not only play for the side, but take up a government job. However, when he, a young Pele, and the rest of the family arrived, things had changed, as Lusitana were now Bauru Athletic Club with new bosses and new ideas. The football side of the contract, Bauru were happy to continue with because Dondinho was a good footballer. The government job, however, not everyone was keen on. Nevertheless, everyone agreed to the deal. When Dondinho didn't play, the family really struggled financially. Pele, his brother, and his sister didn't even have shoes. Pele, being the eldest, wanted to help, which he did by becoming a shoe shiner at 7 years of age. But he had a talent. He was bloody good at football. In 1954 came his first life-changing encounter when the youth side he played for, called Barquinho, were to be managed by former national team player Valdemar de Brito. Pele's talents soon became apparent. In 1954, he and his side won the league title, with Pele scoring a ridiculous 148 goals. De Brito soon left, however, to take up a coaching role at Sao Paulo. However, in 1956 he returned, not to manage though, but to bring Pele to Santos. Once Santos coach Lula saw Pele, he signed him down to a professional contract, and he was promoted as a future superstar. By 1957, he was starting often for Santos, alternating in the attacking midfield position with Del Vecchio, and it didn't take long for Pele to be called up to the national side for Brazil's Copa Roca ties against Argentina at just 16 years of age. To the surprise of nobody, he scored in both legs in a 3-2 aggregate win, becoming Brazil's youngest ever goal scorer, a record he still holds to this very day. The very next year, in 1958, Pele got massive news. He'd been called up to Brazil's World Cup squad. However, in a friendly game against Corinthians, Ari Clemente tackled the boy wonder, injuring his knee. Pele was incredibly close to being dropped from Brazil's World Cup squad. Their doctor, Dr. Hilton Gosling, wasn't convinced at all that Pele would be fit for any of the games. Fortunately, he was kept on, missing out on the first 2 games, and when Mazzola announced that he wasn't feeling too great, it was time for Pele to enter. But was the scrawny 17-year-old ready to make an impact on the world stage? Yes he was. Garrincha was also making his World Cup debut in this game, and Brazil produced what many considered at the time to be the greatest 3 minutes in football history, when the 2 debutants smashed the post, and after brilliant work from the mercurial Didi, Vava slotted the ball past Levi Yashin. The game quickly evened out, with both sides having chances, but after some nice work by Pele, Vava slotted in the killer goal, confirming a 2-0 win and qualification. The Soviets had to go again, and their performance against England can only be described as smash and grab. Peter Braybrook, making his England debut, had one of the more frustrating games he'd ever have, hitting the post twice and having a goal ruled out for handball. Yashin was once again imperious in their Soviet goal, but it was Anatoly Ilyin who'd emerge as the hero, scoring the game's only goal. In their first World Cup, the Soviet Union had qualified for the knockouts, and not for the first time, England had underwhelmed. Heading into the quarterfinals, it became apparent that the group stage playoffs had caused a bit of a problem. The quarterfinals were just 2 days after the group stage playoffs, so it was hardly a surprise that every side that had played in the group stage playoffs lost their quarterfinal tie. The only game that involved sides that hadn't been in a playoff was battled out between West Germany and Yugoslavia. The world champions dominated, but could only squeeze a 1-0 win thanks to a Helmut Rahn goal that involved some shocking goalkeeping. But when your goalkeeper has the audacity to wear number 2, I'd argue he deserves that bit of embarrassment. Meanwhile, in Norrköping, Northern Ireland, with a starting 11 battered and bruised from the playoff with Czechoslovakia, were decimated by a rampant French side 4-0, with Fontaine scoring twice. Over to Solna now, where Sweden carried on their impressive form, this time against the Soviet Union, who were the last away side to beat Sweden back in 1955. Valentin Ivanov was denied what looked a perfectly good goal for offside. Kurt Hamrin too was disallowed a brilliant solo goal for an apparent foul in the build-up. Did you just see one there? Anyway, it was Hamrin who stole the show. Alongside outside left Scotland, they were a constant threat to the USSR, and it was Hamrin who opened the scoring and created the killer goal as Sweden ran away as deserved 2-0 winners. Finally, southwest to Gothenburg. Wales, without their talisman Charles, faced Brazil, who were missing Vava, but as was said in the Times, not even a superhuman defence could deny the vaunted Brazilians a narrow victory their artistry deserved. Welsh keeper Kelsey was in inspired form, but for the first and almost certainly not the only time, Pele made the headlines, as his wonderful individual goal was enough to separate both sides, becoming the youngest goal scorer in World Cup history. At 17 years and 239 days, it's a record he still holds to this very day. Jimmy Murphy believed that his side would have won if Charles had played, but I'm not so sure that even the gentle giant could have stopped the story that Brazil and their teenage sensation were currently telling. Wales may have been on the flight home, but their nation was still being represented, as Merv Griffiths, the notorious referee who flagged Puskas offside in 1954, was selected to referee the semi-final between Brazil and France. The favourites against the top scorers, it was a game that had the potential to be an all-time classic. France were unchanged, but importantly for Brazil, Vava had returned. No matter how strong Brazil were, however, the worry for Brazilian officials was that the side's confidence could be their downfall. Against the side with France's all-star attack, what would happen to Brazil if they conceded their first goal of the tournament? O Seleção started off like a house on fire as Vava slammed the ball into the back of the net after a measured dink from Didi. But only 7 minutes later, Brazil's worst fear came true. A lovely through ball from the wizard Kopa found the inevitable Fontaine, who rounded Gilmar and slammed the ball into the roof of the net. Brazil could have crumbled, but fortunately for them, it was French captain Robert Jonquet's leg that would do the crumbling. When 35 minutes in, he broke his fibula after a collision with Vava, and the centre-half was chucked to the left wing to limp about and make up the numbers. Jonquet once said, "Football is to create, not to destroy." Which is somewhat ironic, because after Jonquet's injury, Brazil created chances and destroyed the French. Rapidly, they made it 2-1 after a thunderstrike from Didi, and in the second half, the world would be introduced to the magic of Pele, as he destroyed the French defence, scoring wonderful goals and bagging a hat-trick in a 5-2 victory. No Brazilian has scored a World Cup hat-trick since. Although Brazil and France was a mouth-watering tie, all eyes were on Gothenburg. Sweden hadn't beaten the German side since 1942, and the only World Cup encounter between the two sides had ended in a German victory in 1934. History would tell us that the world champions were the favourites, but for the first time, Sweden had the pick of every single citizen, a defence that could only be bettered by Brazil, and a manager who had all the confidence in the world. A year earlier, George Reyna forecasted that Sweden will reach the final. Not only was Reyna incredibly confident in his own players, he was also very well prepared for the West Germans. Sweden started off as the more dominant attacking side, but West Germany were always dangerous on the counter. Around 20 minutes into the game, Rahn was denied a clear penalty kick, but sooner rather than later, the world champs got their goal through a wonderful Hans Schäfer strike. Sweden's pressure, however, quickly paid off when a low-driven left-footed strike from Scotland found the back of the net, and the first half ended 1-1, with either side capable of coming out on top. That would change in the second half, with two game-defining moments swinging the tie in Sweden's favour. Firstly, Erik Jaskowiak was sent off for kicking out at Kurt Hamrin. So bad was the kick-out that Jaskowiak travelled to Gothenburg in 1982 to personally apologise to the tricky winger. Then, with around 15 minutes remaining, Fritz Walter was seriously injured after colliding with Siggy Parling. Walter, who could barely walk, carried on playing, but was basically a passenger for the rest of the game, and Sweden capitalised. After a West German free kick, Skåland and Hamrin led the Swedish counter-attack. With one great veteran in Walter looking on in severe pain, Sweden's 37-year-old second division playing icon of Serie A Gunnar Gren unleashed a ferocious strike into the top corner from 20 yards out. Finally, with only 2 minutes remaining, Hamrin made it 3-1 after some shoddy goalkeeping from Fritz Herkenrath. German sports magazine Kicker were very gracious in defeat, giving 3 reasons as to why Sweden deserved to go through. The first being that Sweden should have won the game within the first half hour, the second that Germany didn't have the physical strength the Swedes had, and their final point claimed that you defeat yourself by committing a foul that leads to a sending off. Herberger also made no secret of the fact that Sweden deserved to go through. However, he still believed that Siggy Parling should have been sent off for his challenge on Fritz Walter. Because of the injury, Walter missed the third place playoff, and after 61 games and 33 goals, West Germany's greatest player never played for them again. Speaking of the third place playoff, France won the game 6-3. Just Fontaine scored 4 goals, meaning he ended the World Cup on 13 overall. No player has ever scored as many in a single World Cup tournament, and now he was the World Cup's all-time top scorer, overtaking Sandor Kocic. Unfortunately though, he'd never add to his World Cup tally, as in 1960 he'd suffer a double leg fracture, and in 1962 he'd announced his retirement, aged 28. 29th of June 1958, the big day had arrived. Brazil-Sweden was the first World Cup final featuring nations from different continents, and to mark this momentous day that would crown a first-time World Cup winner, the weather gods gave us grey skies and heavy rain, just like 1954. This was seen to be a benefit for the home side, but the ground staff put in a monumental effort to get the pitch in tip-top condition, something that really touched the Brazilians. And like Pele said, it rains in Brazil too, and we were used to playing on muddy pitches. Sweden won a coin toss for the right to wear yellow, so Brazilian officials went out and bought 13 blue shirts for a combined cost of $35. Ever the superstitious group of people, Brazil saw this as a very bad omen. But the head of the delegation, Dr. Paulo Machado de Carvalho, put a twist on it. In his opinion, the blue shirt would actually bring good luck, as it was the colour of the nation's patron saint, Our Lady of Aparecida. Before the tournament even began, a reporter asked Nils Lederholm if Sweden could reach the final. "If we do, I'll shave my head," he responded. Goalkeeper Kalle Svensson said that he'd do the same, so when Sweden beat West Germany in the semis, they stood by their word and shaved off their precious locks. Englishman George Rayner made World Cup history by becoming the first foreigner to manage in a World Cup final, and he made 0 changes from his semi-final victory. Brazil, on the other hand, made 1 change. Right back Jaume Santos was brought in for the injured Nilton de Sordi. There was a question regarding the fitness of Orlando and Vava, but they made the starting 11. Kickoff was at 3 PM local time, and led out by French referee Maurice Guiget, the teams came out to a crowd expecting an all-time classic. Against France, one of Brazil's main concerns was what would happen if they conceded a goal. They managed to pass that test with flying colours, but what about if they went 1-0 down? Well, when Brazil kicked off, with the trauma of 1950 still hanging over them, that question was asked in no time, as Swedish icon Nils Lederholm went past Orlando and Bellini, eventually slotting the ball into the bottom left corner. Famously, Rayner once said that if the Swedes got the first goal, Brazil would panic all over the show. And it only took 5 minutes for him to be proven wrong, when great work by Garrincha found the unmarked Vava. 1-1. After equalising, Brazil put their foot on the gas. They were all over Sweden. Pele smashed the post from 20 yards out, and the duo of Garrincha and Vava combined once more to make it 2-1, which is how the first half finished. So good were Brazil in that first half, the Times wrote Sweden were bewildered by a brand of football craft beyond the understanding of many. And the second half was more of the same. Jalma and Nilton Santos neutralised Hamrin and Scotland, Gigi ran the show, Brazil kept on scoring, and it was all started off by a wonderful solo goal from Pele. Zagallo made it 4 before Simonsen pulled one back, but the future Real Madrid striker wasn't going to have the last laugh, as this World Cup was going to be finished off by one person and one person only, as Pele scored the 5th goal with a leaping header in added time. With that goal, Sweden's fate was sealed. Brazil were world champions for the very first time, and they became the first side to do it outside of their home continent. Emotion poured out of everyone, most notably Pele, who passed out on the pitch. However, iconic Masseur Mario Americo had one task, and that was to nick the football, which he completed successfully. To thank their host, Brazil completed a lap of honour, parading the Swedish flag before King Gustav congratulated them on their victory. FIFA President Arthur Drury handed the trophy to Captain Bellini, saying, "Here indeed was a match to remember, a clean sporting struggle between 2 great teams." With the trophy in hand, Bellini began the universal tradition of hoisting the Jules Rimet trophy into the air, urged to do so by photographers who wanted a better view. The importance of Brazil's victory cannot be understated. Firstly, they got their World Cup monkey off their back, and they did it by playing some exquisite football. Their football mesmerised fans, journalists, and even their opponents. After scoring their 5th goal, I didn't feel like marking them anymore. I simply wanted to applaud, said Siggy Parling. It was football played with composure, skill, speed, and freedom. But with that freedom, every player knew their role and played it to perfection. They also introduced the world to a back 4, one of the biggest tactical evolutions in the game's history, modernising the sport to the point where a WM would soon be dead in the water. The final was also full of records yet to be broken. Pele is the youngest player and scorer in a World Cup final at 17 years and 249 days. Meanwhile, Gunnar Gren became the oldest player to play in a final at 37 years and 241 days. Nils Lederholm at 35 years and 263 days is the oldest goal scorer in a World Cup final. This final also had the most goals scored by a team with 5 and the most goals in a World Cup final with 7. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the story of the 1958 World Cup, so let's take a quick look at some facts and figures. Overall, a record 35 matches were played at this World Cup, with 126 goals scored, and just over 819,000 fans were there to witness it. The All-Star team, voted by journalists, lined up in a WM, with Harry Gregg in goal, a back 3 of Orvar Bergmark, Hildorado Bellini and Nilton Santos, ahead of them Yuri Voinov and Horst Shimaniak, and the front five of Garrincha, Didi, Raymond Kopa, Pele and Naka Scotland was incredible. Despite scoring more than the entire front five combined, Fontaine only missed out because the votes are split between left and right inside forward positions. Finally, my favourite fact. George Reyna left his post as Sweden gaffer after the final. The man who managed AIK, Lazio, Juventus and Sweden moved back to England to manage Skegness Town to a 6th place finish in the Midlands Counties League. Thanks for watching.